Boone Carter paid $100 for a ghost. Not the kind that rattles chains in the middle of the night. No, he bought something much bigger. He bought a whole ghost town, a place called Redemption Gulch, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the territory where the sun baked the dirt into something that resembled bone. The deed in his pocket, crisp and official, said he owned every last splintered board, every rusted nail, every broken dream that had withered and died there. He'd bought it for peace, for a place to bury the man he used to be, a place where the only voices he'd have to hear were the ones the wind made when it scraped against the canyon walls. He rode his horse over the final rise, the morning sun at his back, and that's when he saw it. The first thing that was wrong: smoke. A thin, gray ribbon of it, curling up from a stone chimney on what was supposed to be the abandoned general store. A chimney the county surveyor swore had collapsed a decade ago. Boone reined in his horse, a cold feeling creeping into his gut. He scanned the rest of the town. The deed described a wasteland of weeds and decay, but down below, nestled between two skeletal buildings, was a patch of green, a garden, tended and cared for. This wasn't right. This wasn't right at all. He urged his horse forward, his hand drifting down, resting just above the worn leather grip of his pistol. He wasn't looking for trouble, but his whole life had taught him that trouble had a way of looking for him. As he got closer, he saw more signs of life. A water barrel full to the brim. Laundry faded and patched, hanging on a line stretched between the store and the old blacksmith shop. He dismounted, the dust swirling around his boots in a silent protest. The town wasn't empty. It was occupied. And through a cracked window pane of the general store, he saw a shadow move. A flicker of motion in a room that was supposed to have been sealed by time itself. The deed in his pocket felt heavy, like a stone. It said he owned this place. Every rock, every speck of dust. But the truth was staring him right in the face. You can't own a place that someone else already calls home. The front door of the general store creaked open, and a woman stepped out into the harsh sunlight. She was older, her face a roadmap of hard years and lost hope. Her hair was gray and tied back in a severe knot. But it wasn't her weathered face that held Boone's attention. It was the rifle she was holding, and she was pointing it directly at his heart. The woman held that rifle like it was a part of her arm. There was no tremor in her hands, no fear in her eyes, just a weary, unshakable resolve, the kind of look a person gets when they've got nothing left to lose, and they know it. Boone kept his hands slow and visible, away from his sidearm. He'd faced down men with guns before, dozens of them. But this was different. This wasn't a gunslinger looking for a reputation. This was a cornered animal protecting its den. "Ma'am," Boone said, his voice calm and even. He stopped a good 20 feet away, giving her space. "I think there might be some confusion here." "No confusion on my end," she replied, her voice as dry as the dirt under his boots. "You're the one who doesn't belong." Behind her, through the open door, Boone could see what she was protecting. It wasn't a store anymore. It was a makeshift home. Blankets hung from the ceiling, creating small, private spaces. Wooden crates were stacked to serve as tables and chairs. On makeshift shelves, he saw tins of food and jars of preserved vegetables. A small fire crackled in a stone hearth that had been built into the center of the room. This wasn't just a camp. This was a life, pieced together from the ruins of another. "I have the deed," Boone said, patting the pocket of his jacket. "Bought this whole town, from the county, legal and proper." The woman let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "Legal and proper. That's a good one." She took a step forward, the rifle never wavering. "That's what the man from the bank said when he took my husband's farm. Legal and proper. That's what the sheriff said when he nailed the foreclosure notice to our door. Legal and proper. And that's what they called it when they left my family with nothing but the clothes on our backs and nowhere to go but here." Suddenly, from deep inside the building, a sound echoed out. A cough. A terrible, wet, racking cough that spoke of sickness, of lungs fighting for every breath. The woman's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second. Her eyes darted back toward the sound, a flicker of raw fear crossing her face, before her gaze snapped back to Boone, harder than before. "That's my granddaughter. she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She's sick, and this is the only shelter we have for 100 miles in any direction. So you can take your piece of paper, your legal and proper deed, and you can get back on your horse and ride straight back to wherever it is you came from. Boone felt something twist in his gut. He hadn't come here to be a landlord. He hadn't come here to evict a sick child and her grandmother. He'd come here for silence, for solitude. He'd imagined walking through empty buildings, the only sound the creak of floorboards under his boots. He'd pictured himself patching a roof, fixing a wall, making one small corner of this dead town his own. He had never, not in a million years, pictured this. He could see the desperation radiating from her like heat from the ground. She wasn't threatening him, not really. She was pleading, pleading with the only language she had left. The coughing started again, worse this time. It was a violent, desperate sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The woman's grip on her rifle tightened. She wasn't pointing it at him anymore. She was just holding it. Ready, always ready. She needs medicine, the woman said, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. And rest. And a roof that doesn't leak when the winter rains come. Boone looked past her at the ramshackle home they'd built inside the store. He looked at the other buildings in his town. His town. Some had roofs caved in. Others had walls that looked like a strong wind could knock them over. He owned all of it. The law said so. The paper in his pocket was proof. The law gave him the right to tell them to leave, to cast them out into the wilderness. But as he looked into the eyes of this desperate grandmother and listened to the sound of that sick child fighting for breath, the law felt like a cold, sharp thing, and he didn't want to touch it. From inside the store came a sudden clatter, a muffled thump, followed by a weak, terrified cry. "Grandma!" The rifle fell from Dorothy Whitmore's hands, hitting the dusty porch with a loud crack. All the fight drained out of her, replaced by a mother's terror. She spun around and rushed back inside, disappearing into the shadows. Boone didn't even think. He just moved. He took the porch steps in a single stride and followed her in, stepping over the threshold of a world that shouldn't have existed in his ghost town. The inside of the store was dim, the only light coming from the open door and the cracks in the walls. It smelled of wood smoke, dust, and sickness. In the far corner, on a pallet made of old blankets and burlap sacks, lay a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but she was so thin, so fragile. She looked like a bird with a broken wing. Her skin was as pale as bleached bone, and dark feverish circles bruised the skin under her eyes. An overturned water bucket lay on the floor beside her, a dark stain spreading across the warped wooden planks. This was Zara. Her breathing was a series of short, shallow gasps. When she coughed, her entire tiny frame convulsed with the effort, a rattling sound that seemed to come from the very bottom of her lungs. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice a reedy thread of sound. "I'm sorry. The bucket. It was too heavy." Dorothy knelt beside her, ignoring the spilled water. She pressed the back of a calloused, trembling hand to the girl's forehead. The tenderness in that simple gesture, the sheer force of love in that touch, hit Boone harder than any bullet ever could. "Her fever's worse," Dorothy murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. She looked up at Boone, and the defiance was gone from her eyes. The anger was gone. All that was left was a raw, bottomless desperation that clawed at him. "She needs a doctor," Dorothy said, her voice cracking. "Real medicine. Not just the herbs and roots I've been able to find out here." Boone took in the scene. The leaky roof, evidenced by the dark water stains on the walls. The uneven floor. The meager supplies on the shelves. This place wasn't a shelter. It was a tomb in waiting. Winter was coming, and this place wouldn't keep out the cold. It wouldn't keep out anything. "The nearest doctor's in Millfield," Boone said, his mind racing. "That's a 2-day ride from here, at least." "I know where it is," Dorothy snapped, a spark of her old fire returning. "You think I haven't thought of that? You think I haven't laid awake every single night, counting the miles, trying to figure out a way?" She stood up, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "We had money once. We had a wagon, 2 strong horses, but the bank took it all. Said my husband had defaulted on a loan he never even signed his name to. Zara started coughing again, a deep, ugly sound that tore through the quiet room. Dorothy was instantly back at her side, helping the little girl sit up, rubbing her back until the fit subsided. When the coughing stopped, Dorothy looked at Boone, her face a mask of weary defeat. "How much?" she asked, the word catching in her throat. "How much do you want? For us to stay? Just until the spring. Just until she's strong enough to travel." She started talking faster, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I can work. I'll do anything. I can cook, clean, mend your clothes, tend to your animals. Anything you need. Just, just don't make us leave." The deed in Boone's pocket felt like it was burning a hole through his coat. He owned this place. Every broken beam, every loose floorboard. He had the legal right to throw them out. But looking at the sick child, at the grandmother who would clearly die for her, the law seemed like a very small, very distant thing. "I don't need workers," he said, choosing his words carefully. He saw Dorothy's face crumple. He saw the last glimmer of hope die in her eyes. She thought he was saying no. She thought this was it, the end of the line. But before she could say a word, before Boone could explain what he was really thinking, a new sound cut through the air, the sound of horses, multiple horses, riding hard and fast. Dorothy went rigid. Her eyes flew to the window, wide with a terror that was deeper and colder than anything Boone had seen yet. "Oh no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They found us." 3 riders thundered into Redemption Gulch like they were the kings of this forgotten land. And until about an hour ago, they probably thought they were. Their leader was a lean, wolfish man with eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. A tin star was pinned to his vest, glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode 2 deputies, both of whom wore the same smug, cruel expression, the kind of men who enjoyed their work a little too much. Sheriff Marcus Crowe swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with an arrogant thud. His cold eyes swept over the scene, taking in Boone, the smoke from the chimney, the impossible little garden. His lips curled into a sneer. "Well, well," Crowe said, his voice dripping with the kind of satisfaction a predator feels when it has its prey cornered. "Dorothy Whitmore, you've led us quite a chase." Dorothy moved to stand in the doorway, her body a shield, blocking the sheriff's view of the sick child inside. "We're not trespassing, Marcus. This land, it belongs to someone else now." "That's Sheriff Crowe to you," he replied. But his attention had already shifted to Boone. He looked him up and down, a flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, in his eyes. "And you must be the fool who bought this worthless pile of rocks from the county." Boone felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was history here, bad blood, the kind of hatred that doesn't fade with time, but festers. "I have legal ownership," Boone said, his voice steady. "The deed is clear." Crowe laughed, a harsh, ugly sound with no humor in it. "Legal ownership? That's rich." He took a step closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Tell me, friend, did the county happen to mention they sold you land with outstanding debts attached? Mrs. Whitmore here owes a considerable sum to the Millfield Bank. Unpaid loans, penalties." Dorothy's face went white. "Those loans were forgeries. My husband never signed a thing." "Your dead husband can't testify to that, can he?" Crowe shot back, his voice like a whip crack. "But his signature is on file at the bank, along with the accumulated interest. The late fees comes to about $800 now." $800. The number hung in the air, heavy and impossible. It was a fortune. More money than most folks saw in 5 years of backbreaking work. It was more than Dorothy could ever hope to have, and it was certainly 8 times what Boone had paid for the entire town. "She doesn't have $800, Boone said, stating the obvious. "No," Crowe agreed, his smile widening. "No, she doesn't, which is why she's coming with us. The bank has other ways of settling a debt." One of the deputies, a burly man with a mean-looking scar on his cheek, stepped forward, his hand also on his gun. "Ma'am," he drawled, "you need to come along peaceful now." From inside the store, Zara's coughing started again, a desperate, breathless sound. Dorothy's hands were shaking, but she stood her ground, a lioness protecting her cub. My granddaughter is sick, she pleaded, her voice thick with unshed tears. She can't travel. Then you should have thought of that before you ran out on your obligations, Crow replied, his voice devoid of any sympathy. The child will come too. The bank always recovers its investments, one way or another. Boone felt a dark, cold anger begin to uncoil in his chest. He'd seen this kind of frontier justice before. He knew what happened to people who owed money they couldn't pay. He knew what kind of work they were sent to do, especially the women. And he knew what happened to children who were too sick to be of any use. They were discarded, forgotten, left to die. What kind of work are we talking about? Boone asked, though he already knew the answer. Crow's smile was the ugliest thing Boone had ever seen. The kind that pays off debts real efficient. Dorothy's composure finally shattered. Please, she whispered, the word a ragged breath. She's just a child. She's sick. Can't you see she's sick? But Crow wasn't listening. He was already signaling his deputies to move in. They advanced on the store, their steps slow and deliberate, the confident swagger of men who had done this 100 times before, men who knew exactly how to break a desperate woman. And that's when Boone Carter, the man who had come to this place seeking nothing but peace and quiet, made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the deputies and Dorothy. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, and came to rest on the worn grip of his own gun. The lady, he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of steel, said no. The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The birds went silent. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the sick child inside the store. Sheriff Crow's eyes, which had dismissed Boone as a fool just moments before, now narrowed into dangerous slits. He studied Boone, really studied him for the first time. He took in the way Boone stood, perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. He saw the worn leather of his gun belt, molded by years of use, and he saw the complete and utter absence of fear in Boone's eyes. You don't want to get involved in this, friend, Crow said, and his voice had changed. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a cautious, calculating tone. The tone of a man who has just realized he might have mistaken a rattlesnake for a garter snake. Too late for that, Boone replied, his hand never leaving the butt of his pistol. These people are on my land. That makes this my business. One of the deputies, a younger man with nervous, shifty eyes, licked his lips. Sheriff, he muttered, maybe we should just come back another time. Shut up, Collins, Crow snapped, his gaze locked on Boone. You have any idea what you're interfering with here? Enlighten me, Boone said. Crow spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Mrs. Whitmore's husband, Thomas, he borrowed a substantial amount of money from the Millfield Bank. Signed the papers, made the promises. Then he had the poor judgment to die before paying it back. The debt falls to his family. It's the law. Convenient, Boone said, his voice flat. Dead men can't dispute a signature. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Dorothy was frozen in the doorway behind him, trapped between a sliver of hope and a mountain of terror. Crow took a half step forward, trying to reestablish his dominance. You know what I think? He said, his voice low and menacing. I think you're new here. I think you don't understand how things work. This territory has laws and I enforce them. The bank has rights and I protect them. Mrs. Whitmore has debts and I collect them. Simple as that. And if those debts were fabricated, Boone countered. That's not for you to decide, Crow snarled, his patience finally snapping. His hand dropped, closing around the grip of his own gun. Now for the last time, step aside. Boone didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Show me the papers. What? The loan documents, Boone said. The ones with Thomas Whitmore's signature on them. If this debt is as real as you say it is, then prove it. For just a split second, a flicker of uncertainty, of panic, crossed Crow's face. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. He had been challenged, publicly, and he couldn't back down. I don't have to prove anything to you, he hissed. Then you don't get to take them. The nervous deputy Collins took a full step backward. Sheriff, This is getting out of hand. I said shut up, Crow roared. He glared at Boone, his mind clearly racing, searching for a way out of this standoff. Then a slow, cunning smile spread across his face. He had found one. You want to see the papers? He said, his voice suddenly calm, almost friendly. Fine. You want proof, you'll get it. We'll ride back to Millfield. I'll get the bank president himself, Mr. Abernathy, to come out here with every last piece of documentation you could possibly want. But that'll take time. We'll be back tomorrow morning. Dorothy made a small choke sound of relief, a reprieve, a whole day. But Crow wasn't finished. His eyes glinted with malice. Of course, he continued, that also means I'll have time to pick up a friend of mine, a federal marshal. And when he gets here, and he sees you interfering with a lawful officer in the collection of a legal debt, well, you'll be the one leaving this place in chains. The trap snapped shut. It was a brilliant move. Crow was giving him an out, a chance to walk away, to save his own skin. All he had to do was step aside. Let them take Dorothy and the girl. Forget he ever saw them. He could have his ghost town. He could have his peace and quiet. And then, from inside the store, Zara coughed again. A weak, painful, rattling sound that cut right through him. Boone knew he had made his choice the moment he saw Dorothy standing on that porch, rifle in hand, fear in her eyes. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to admit it to himself. He looked Sheriff Crow dead in the eye. Bring your marshal, Boone said, his voice as cold as a grave. Bring your papers. Bring whoever you want. Crow's smile vanished. He stared at Boone for a long moment, a strange mix of disbelief and fury on his face. Then he turned on his heel without another word, swung himself up onto his horse, and galloped away, his deputies scrambling to follow. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded, Dorothy finally spoke, her voice a terrified whisper in the sudden silence. They'll be back, she said, and they'll have enough men to take us all. Once the dust from Crow's posse had settled, the last of Dorothy's strength seemed to evaporate. She sagged against the doorframe, her hands shaking, the full weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. Why? She asked, her voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. She didn't look at him. She just stared out at the empty space where the sheriff had been. Why would you do that? Risk everything for strangers? Boone didn't have an easy answer. He could have told her about the man he used to be, about the things he had done, the things he was trying to leave behind. He could have told her that he knew what it was like to be powerless, to have everything taken from you by men who smiled while they did it. But he didn't. Some stories are best left buried. Tell me about the loan, he said instead. Dorothy was quiet for a long time. So long he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she straightened up, pulling a reserve of strength from some deep, hidden well. My husband, Thomas, he never borrowed money from anyone in his life, she said, her voice firm now, laced with righteous anger. He was a proud man, stubborn. He used to say that debt was just another kind of chain, and he'd die before he wore another man's chains. She paused, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. But then, a month after we buried him, a man from the bank showed up, Mr. Abernathy. He had papers, documents with Thomas's signature on them, saying he owed thousands for land improvements we never made, for new equipment we never bought. Did you ever see him sign anything? Boone asked. Never, and I handled all our business. Thomas, he couldn't read or write much, just enough to sign his name. I did all the books, paid all the bills. Her voice turned bitter, sharp as broken glass. Which is why it was so convenient when they told me I wasn't allowed to contest the debt. A woman, they said, can't challenge her dead husband's legal obligations. The signature was all that mattered. Boone felt a familiar, ugly anger churning in his gut. This wasn't just a simple case of a forged signature. This was a system, a well-oiled machine designed to strip mine families of everything they had. Corrupt bankers, crooked lawmen, all working together, all getting rich off the misery of people who couldn't fight back. From inside the store, a weak voice called out, "Grandma!" Dorothy was gone in a flash, rushing to Zara's side. Boone followed, his boots heavy on the creaking floorboards. The little girl looked even worse than before. Her cheeks were flushed with a dangerous blotchy red, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. She tried to sit up, but she was too weak. "I'm thirsty," Zara whispered, her lips dry and cracked. Dorothy reached for the water bucket beside the bed, but it was the one that had been knocked over. It was empty. "The well out back still works," she told Boone, her attention never leaving her granddaughter. Sometimes. Boone took the bucket without a word and headed outside. The well was old, its stone sides crumbling and its wooden frame weathered and gray. But he lowered the bucket, and after a moment of resistance, the rope went slack. He hauled it back up, hand over hand, and was surprised to find it heavy with cold, clear water. As he worked the crank, his mind was racing. $800. It was an impossible sum for Dorothy, but not for him. Tucked away in his saddlebags was nearly $2,000, saved from years of hard work, careful living, and more than a few successful cattle drives where the profits weren't exactly taxed. He could pay the debt. He could walk back in there, hand Dorothy the money, and tell her to pay Crow when he returned. Problem solved. But it felt wrong. Paying the debt would be an admission of its legitimacy. It would be rewarding Abernathy and Crow for their crimes. It would be putting his stamp of approval on their whole rotten system. And what would happen to the next family they targeted? And the one after that? He'd be saving Dorothy and Zara, but he'd be condemning countless others. When he returned with a full bucket of water, Dorothy was gently stroking Zara's hair, humming a soft, sad lullaby. "She needs medicine," she said without looking up. "Real medicine, from a real doctor, and she needs it soon." "Crow said the nearest doctor is in Millfield," Boone said, setting the bucket down. "Same town where the bank is," Dorothy replied, her voice flat. "Same town where Crow is the law. If we go there, we'll never come back out. They'll take Zara from me, say I'm an unfit guardian because of the debt. They'll take her, and they'll take me, and that will be the end of it." Boone looked at the sick child, and then at the determined grandmother. They couldn't run. Zara was too sick. They couldn't hide. Crow knew where they were. They couldn't fight, not against a federal marshal and a town full of deputies. They were trapped. "There might be another way," Boone said slowly, a desperate, half-formed idea beginning to take shape in his mind. "But it would mean trusting me, completely." Dorothy finally looked up, her tired eyes searching his face, trying to read his intentions. "What kind of way?" But before Boone could answer, they heard it again. Hoofbeats, not from the direction Crow had taken. This was from the east, and it wasn't 3 riders this time. It was more. Many more. Boone moved to the window, his hand once again on his gun. A cloud of dust was rising from the plains, a massive, swirling column that spoke of a large group of riders moving at speed. They weren't lawmen. Their movements were too ragged, too urgent. He watched as they crested the final hill and thundered down into Redemption Gulch. And as they got closer, Boone felt a growing sense of dread. These weren't enemies, but they weren't exactly saviors either. They were something else entirely. They were an army of the desperate. The riders who poured into the ghost town weren't soldiers or lawmen. They were farmers, ranchers, ordinary folks with work-worn hands and worried eyes. But every single one of them was armed, and they all wore the same expression of grim, desperate determination that Boone had seen on Dorothy's face. Their leader was a woman who swung down from her horse with a weary grace. She was about Dorothy's age, but where Dorothy's face showed the strain of running and hiding, this woman's face was set with the focused, burning anger of someone who had decided to stop running and start fighting. "Dorothy Whitmore," the woman called out, her voice carrying across the dusty street. "We've been looking for you." Dorothy stepped out of the store, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ruth? Ruth Henley, what are you doing here?" "Same thing you are," Ruth replied, gesturing to the dozen or so riders behind her, "trying to stay alive." She walked closer, her eyes taking in Boone with a cautious appraisal. "We're all of us families that got hit by Crow and Abernathy's little scheme. Every last one of us had a husband or a father who mysteriously signed loan papers for things they never bought, right before they had the bad luck of dying." The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place for Boone, and the picture they were forming was bigger and uglier than he had imagined. This wasn't just about the Whitmores. This was a conspiracy, a land grab, orchestrated on a massive scale. How many? Dorothy asked, her voice trembling. 15 families that we know of, Ruth said grimly. Probably more. Some folks just disappeared, gave up and ran rather than fight a battle they knew they couldn't win. Her sharp gaze shifted to Boone. And you'd be the man who bought himself a town full of trouble. Seems that way, Boone agreed. Ruth studied him for a long, silent moment, as if weighing his worth. She must have liked what she saw because she nodded slightly. We heard about your run-in with Crow. Word travels fast. We also heard he's bringing a federal marshal back with him. He is, Boone confirmed. Well, here's something you might not know, Ruth said, lowering her voice. That marshal, a man by the name of Davidson, he's been on Abernathy's payroll for years. He's not coming here to deliver justice. He's coming here to rubber stamp a land theft. The sliver of hope Boone had been holding on to, that the law, the real law, might still mean something, died a quick and painless death. The whole system was rotten, from the local sheriff all the way up. So what's your plan? Dorothy asked, her voice laced with despair. Evidence, Ruth said, her eyes flashing with a fierce light. Real, undeniable evidence that proves the signatures were forged, and we think we know where to find it. She pulled a folded, grimy piece of paper from her jacket pocket. There was a clerk at the bank, a young man named Samuel Chen. He's the one Abernathy had doing the forgeries. Apparently, the boy grew a conscience. He sent word last week. He's willing to testify. He says he kept a secret ledger, a record of every single forgery he was forced to create. Where is he? Boone asked, his voice urgent. Hiding out at the old Black Creek mining camp, about 20 miles north of here, deep in the Badlands. A dark look crossed Ruth's face. But Crow's got men looking for him, too. And if they find him before we do... She didn't need to finish the sentence. A dead witness can't testify. Dorothy looked back toward the store, where Zara's labored breathing was a constant, painful reminder of the stakes. I can't leave her, she whispered. She's too sick to travel. We know, Ruth said, her voice softening. That's why we came here. This place, it's defensible. We make our stand here. She laid out the plan. It was simple, desperate, and dangerous. Some of them would stay, fortify the town, and protect Dorothy and Zara. The rest, a smaller, faster group, would ride to the mining camp, get Samuel Chen and his ledger, and bring them back before the marshal arrived. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. There's another problem, Boone said, thinking it through. Even if you get the ledger, even if Chen testifies, what's to stop the marshal from just declaring you all outlaws, arresting you, and burning this place to the ground? It would be your word against his. Ruth's smile was grim. Nothing. Which is why we're not just gathering evidence. She gestured back toward the horizon, back the way she'd come. And for the first time, Boone saw it. More dust clouds, smaller, farther away, but approaching from all different directions. Word's been spreading for weeks about what Abernathy's been doing, Ruth continued, a note of pride in her voice. We sent riders out. We told our story to anyone who would listen. Those dust clouds? That's newspaper men from 3 different towns, a territorial investigator from the capital who's been looking for a reason to go after Abernathy for years. Even some of the tribal elders from the reservation are on their way. They've had their own run-ins with the Millfield Bank. Dorothy stared at the approaching riders, her eyes wide with a dawning, fragile hope. You're turning this into a circus. We're turning this into a public spectacle, Ruth corrected her fiercely. Something too big, too loud, and too visible for them to sweep under the rug. But just as that fragile hope began to take root, a terrible, violent coughing fit erupted from inside the store. It was worse than before, a wet, choking sound that ended in a thin, weak cry for help. Dorothy and Boone rushed inside. Zara was trying to sit up, her face a terrifying shade of bluish gray. Her eyes were unfocused, rolling back in her head. Something's wrong, Dorothy whispered, her voice shaking with panic. This is different. It's worse. Boone knelt beside the child. He saw it immediately, flecks of bright red blood on her pale lips. Her breathing was becoming more and more shallow, each tiny gasp a monumental effort. We need that doctor, Dorothy said, her voice breaking into a sob. We need him now. And as if their desperation had summoned him from the very depths of hell, a new sound cut through the air. A single horse, approaching at a full gallop. Boone looked out the window and his blood ran cold. It was Sheriff Crow. He was riding alone, his horse lathered in sweat, pushing it as if the devil himself were on his tail. He reined the horse to a skidding stop in the middle of the street, and when he swung down from the saddle, Boone could see something in the man's face that hadn't been there before. Raw, naked fear. Sheriff Crow looked like a man who had just stared into his own open grave. His hands were shaking, and his usual arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered rat. His eyes darted from the armed families to the approaching dust clouds on the horizon, and he seemed to shrink in on himself. This has gone too far, he said, his voice a hoarse croak. Way too far. Ruth Henley stepped forward, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. What's the matter, Sheriff? Lose your nerve? What happened to your federal marshal? Crow let out a bitter, desperate laugh. The marshal's dead, he choked out. Shot down on the road from Millfield. The words landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp went through the crowd of settlers. Boone felt Dorothy stiffen beside him. If the witness they were counting on had just killed a federal officer, their cause wasn't just lost, it was damned. Chen would be hunted like an animal. His testimony, his ledger, all of it would be worthless. He'd be branded a murderer, and by extension, so would they all. You're lying, Ruth said, but her voice lacked conviction. Am I? Crow fumbled inside his jacket and pulled out a blood-stained silver badge. He held it up for all to see. Found this on the road, right next to Marshal Davidson's body. He took a deep, shuddering breath. Chen left a note, pinned it to the marshal's chest, said he wouldn't be taken alive, said he'd rather die fighting than hang for forgery. Boone watched Crow's face, searching for the lie. The man was terrified, that much was true. He believed what he was saying. The marshal was dead, but there was something else in his expression, something hidden beneath the fear, a deep, unsettling confusion. The story didn't quite sit right, and some part of Crow knew it. Where's Chen now? Boone asked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Gone! Crow almost shouted the word. Vanished into the mountains. And according to the note, he took his ledger with him, a ledger with enough evidence on Abernathy, on the bank, on half the officials in this territory, to hang us all. His voice dropped to a terrified whisper. Including me. The confession hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Crow wasn't just a crooked lawman anymore. He was a co-conspirator in a scheme that had just escalated to the murder of a federal officer. He was a dead man walking. Around them, the settlers shifted restlessly, hands moving to their weapons. The situation was a powder keg, and Crow had just lit the fuse. And then, from inside the store, came something worse than any gunshot. Silence. Zara's coughing had stopped. Dorothy let out a strangled cry and bolted back inside. Her scream, a raw, primal sound of pure agony, brought everyone running. The little girl lay motionless on her makeshift bed. Her skin had taken on a grayish, waxy pallor. Her breathing was so shallow, so faint, you could barely see the rise and fall of her chest. A small dark trickle of blood ran from the corner of her mouth, staining the blanket beneath her head. Her eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. She's dying, Dorothy sobbed, gathering Zara's limp form into her arms. My baby's dying, and there's nothing I can do. Boone knelt beside them, pressing 2 fingers to the child's neck. He could feel a pulse, but it was faint and thready, fluttering like a trapped bird's wings. The sickness, whatever it was, had reached its crisis point. The nearest doctor is still 2 days away, Dorothy said, her voice breaking apart. Even if we left right now, Boone finished quietly, she wouldn't survive the journey. The hope that had filled the street just moments before now curdled into a thick, choking despair. Outside, they could hear the first of the new riders arriving. The newspaper men, the investigator. People who had come expecting a story, a confrontation. They were about to walk into a tragedy. Crow appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He looked down at the dying child, and for the first time, Boone saw something in the man's eyes that might have been a flicker of genuine remorse. "There's a doctor," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, "at the tribal settlement, in the mountains. An old medicine man. They say he's saved folks the white doctors gave up on." "That's 30 miles of the roughest country in this territory," Ruth protested from the doorway. "Less than half that, if you know the old trails," Crow replied, his eyes never leaving Zara. "And I know them." Dorothy looked up from her granddaughter's still form, her face a war between suspicion and a desperate, grasping hope. "Why?" she whispered. "After everything you've done, why would you help us?" Crow was quiet for a long moment, the sounds of the arriving riders filling the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, older, weaker, stripped of all its bluster and lies. "Because I have a granddaughter too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And because I'm tired. I'm just so tired of being the kind of man who lets children die for money." It was a confession, a plea for his own kind of redemption. But even as the words left his mouth, a new sound shattered the fragile moment. Shouts from the street outside, the sharp, distinctive crack of rifle fire, and beneath it all, the thunder of many, many horses approaching at a full gallop. The reporters and the investigator had arrived, but so had someone else. The bank's private army was here, and they hadn't come to negotiate. The dozen or so hired guns who served as the Millfield Bank's private army rode into Redemption Gulch, expecting to find a few scared farmers and a cowering woman. They were led by a man with a scarred face and dead eyes named Pike, a man who had made a career out of breaking people for money. They were not expecting to be met by a volley of rifle fire from 24 armed settlers dug in behind barricades. They were not expecting 3 newspaper reporters, cameras flashing, capturing every moment of their illegal assault. And they certainly were not expecting a steely-eyed territorial investigator named Williams, who stood in the middle of the street with a leather satchel in one hand, calmly documenting their crimes. The firefight was short, brutal, and decisive. Pike's men were mercenaries, not soldiers. They were paid to intimidate, not to die. When the smoke cleared, half of them were wounded or disarmed. The other half had thrown down their guns and surrendered. Pike himself was on his knees in the dirt, a bleeding gash on his forehead, demanding to know who was in charge. "That would be me," Boone said, stepping out from behind the cover of the blacksmith's shop, his pistol still smoking. Pike spat a wad of blood into the dust. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he snarled. "The bank, Mr. Abernathy, he owns this whole territory." "Not anymore," a new voice said. The investigator, Williams, walked forward, opening his satchel. "Funny thing about that dead federal marshal," he said, his voice calm and clear for all to hear. "He isn't dead." Crow's face went white as a sheet. "Marshal Davidson is alive and well," Williams continued, pulling a stack of papers from his bag. "He's recovering at the tribal settlement as we speak. Turns out Samuel Chen didn't try to kill him. He saved his life. The truth, when it came, was like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of everyone. It was Pike's men here who ambushed the marshal on the road," Williams explained, his eyes locking onto the captured mercenary leader. "They were sent by Abernathy to kill Davidson and steal Chen's ledger. But Chen fought back. He took a bullet meant for the marshal, giving Davidson the chance to escape. The blood on that badge? That was Samuel Chen's blood." The story Crow had been fed was a lie, a carefully constructed deception designed to turn them all against each other, to paint the one man who could bring them all down as a cold-blooded killer. Crow hadn't just been a pawn in their game. He'd been the unwitting messenger, sent to deliver the lie that would have condemned them all. He stared at his hands, at the badge he had carried, and a look of profound, soul-crushing shame washed over his face. But none of it mattered to Dorothy. While the world outside was being turned upside down by revelations of murder and corruption, her world had shrunk to the tiny, fragile life flickering in her arms. Zara's breathing was almost non-existent now. Each faint puff of air could be her last. "She needs help," Dorothy cried out, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Please, she needs help now." Crow looked at the dying child. He looked at the chaos in the street. He looked at his horse, fresh and fast. And in that moment, Marcus Crow, the corrupt sheriff, The broken man made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "I'll take her," he said, his voice filled with a sudden, desperate purpose. "I'll take her to the tribal doctor. I know the trails. I can get her there faster than anyone." "I'm coming with you," Dorothy said, her voice fierce and unyielding. "And me," Boone added, without a second's hesitation. They worked quickly, fashioning a travois, a simple sled made from blankets and long wooden poles that could be dragged behind Crow's powerful horse. They gently secured Zara, wrapping her in every blanket they could find. As they prepared to leave, Ruth Henley came running up, her face alight with a joy that seemed impossible just moments before. She pressed an official-looking document into Dorothy's hands. "This came with the investigator," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a declaration. From the territorial governor. All the forged debts, they're null and void. The Millfield Bank is being seized. Abernathy's been arrested." She grabbed Dorothy's arm, her eyes shining with tears. "You're free, Dorothy. All of you. You're free." Dorothy looked at the paper, at the official seals and flowing script that gave her back her life. Then she looked down at the pale, still face of her granddaughter. Freedom meant nothing if Zara didn't live to see it. The journey to the tribal settlement was a desperate, frantic race against death. Crow rode like a man possessed, his knowledge of the hidden trails and secret passes a thing of beauty and precision. He pushed his horse through narrow canyon gaps that scraped their legs raw, forded streams of rushing, ice-cold water, and navigated rocky slopes that would have broken the spirit of a lesser man. Boone rode alongside, helping to steady the travois, his eyes constantly on the small, still form wrapped in the blankets. What should have been a day's journey, they made in just under 6 hours. They arrived at the settlement not as lawmen or intruders, but as desperate supplicants. The tribal doctor, an ancient, wizened man named Joseph Whitehorse, met them with calm, knowing eyes. He examined Zara with hands that were as gentle as a summer breeze. He didn't speak much. He simply worked, using herbs that smelled of the earth, chanting softly in a language as old as the mountains themselves. "Pneumonia," he said at last, his voice a low rumble. "The sickness of the lungs. But it is not too late. Not yet." For 3 days and 3 nights they stayed at the settlement, caught in a strange, timeless limbo between hope and despair. Dorothy never once left Zara's side, holding her hand, whispering stories to her, willing her to live. Boone found himself helping around the village, chopping wood, hauling water, doing anything to keep his hands and mind busy. And Sheriff Crow, he sat by himself under the shade of a tall pine tree, and he wrote. He filled page after page with a detailed confession, writing down every crime, every bribe, every name, every single rotten detail of the conspiracy he had been a part of. He wrote until his fingers were cramped and his soul was bare. On the morning of the 4th day, a small voice cut through the quiet of the morning. "Grandma, I'm thirsty." Zara's eyes were open. They were clear. The fever had broken. 6 months later, the ghost town known as Redemption Gulch had a new name. The settlers, the families who had fought and bled for it, now called it Haven. Boone Carter, the man who had bought a town for $100, had given it all away. He had divided the land, giving a plot to every family that had been cheated by the bank. He kept only a small piece for himself, a small ranch where he raised a few cattle and grew a small vegetable garden. Dorothy, with Zara now healthy and strong at her side, reopened the general store. But now it was a real store, filled with supplies and goods, the heart of their new, thriving community. Zara, her laughter now as bright and clear as a spring morning, could often be seen chasing chickens in the street, her past sickness nothing more than a distant, hazy dream. And Marcus Crow, after serving a short sentence in the territorial prison, his sentence lightened by his confession and his role in saving Zara's life, returned to Haven. He pinned his old tin star back on his chest, but this time, he served the people, not the powerful. He was their sheriff, their protector, their friend. The Millfield Bank was a memory, its assets seized and distributed among the families it had wronged. The territory was cleaner, safer. A new chapter had begun. One evening, as the autumn sun painted the hills in shades of orange and gold, Boone stood in his garden, watching the light fade. He saw Zara helping Dorothy close up the store for the night. He saw neighbors sharing a meal on their porches. He heard the sound of laughter, of life, of hope. He had come here seeking silence, a place to bury his ghosts. Instead, he had found a home. He had found a family, and he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: redemption. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. Your support is what allows us to keep telling these incredible stories. And if you have a story of your own about a time when a community came together to fight for what was right, we'd love to read about it in the comments below. Thanks for listening.